Welcome to Fast Fuel, your bite-sized sports nutrition podcast designed to help you get the latest science, news and insights from the world of performance nutrition in 20 minutes or less, brought to you by Get Pro Professional. I'm your host, James Morehen, and I have over 10 years experience working in professional and elite sport, from sports like rugby, football and boxing, but also endurance athletes. Each episode, we will be joined by a special guest working at the forefront of elite sport or academia to get their nuggets of knowledge on their own specialist area of sports or sports nutrition. From learning how to fuel and support teams through major tournaments, to starting out as a new sports nutritionist and hearing the latest on protein science and research, we have you covered here on Fast Fuel. So sit back, relax and get ready to learn from the best of the best in the world of sports nutrition. Welcome to Fast Fuel. Let's go. Today, we're joined by Olly Witard, reader in nutrition and exercise metabolism at King's College London, to talk about the future of protein science. So, Olly, would you please tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your current roles?
Yeah, so my name's Olly Witard. I'm a reader in nutrition and exercise metabolism at King's College London in the UK. And I've been there for 6 years. So my role is set between teaching students in nutrition and sports nutrition, but also doing some research in protein nutrition. So I'm trying to, as the name of the webcast is, look at the future of protein nutrition in application to sports performance, athlete performance, but also in relation to healthy aging primarily.
Yeah, awesome. So Olly, before we start, we always ask guests 3 icebreaker questions. So what is your favourite sporting moment of all time?
It has to be Andy Murray's first Wimbledon victory.
Amazing. Were you there?
I wasn't. I was on holiday. And so I was in a good place anyway. And then for Andy Murray to win was incredible. It made the holiday even more special.
Yeah, and where were you?
We were in Mauritius.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
And what about a meal that you could not live without?
It has to be spaghetti bolognese. It would be my go-to meal every time.
Nice and simple. And when you were a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
A PE teacher.
Yeah.
It was always a PE teacher.
Nice. Very good. Look, today is all about the future of protein science and really what is the next big thing. And so tell us about any interesting research into protein that you've been involved in over the last couple of years.
So probably the research that I'm, I suppose, most notable for is the protein dose work in terms of characterizing the optimal amount of protein to maximally stimulate what we call muscle protein synthesis, which is seen as we call it the gold standard in a research scenario, but is seen as the agreed upon method to determine the anabolic response of the muscle to a protein source. So in short, we looked at 4 different doses of whey protein. We gave that to trained individuals, males. They were university athletes, so they weren't necessarily elite athletes. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit further on, because most of the work in protein nutrition isn't done with the elites. It's done with university exercises. We gave them 4 different doses of whey protein and measured muscle protein synthesis rates with muscle biopsies and what we call isotope tracers, and showed that the muscle anabolic response, so the muscle protein synthesis response, was maximized with 20 grams of whey protein. The additional 20 grams didn't further stimulate the muscle anabolic response. Now, that was back in 2014, and things have moved on, and we know much more about our optimal dose than we did back in 2014. But that's probably the research that I'm most, I suppose, known for. I suppose, and I was the postdoc researcher, so I was in the lab doing the hands-on work, whereas my mentor Kevin Tipton was leading that research.
What are the current hot topics in protein and sport nutrition research that you're seeing?
I think it has to be around sustainability. Is sustainable proteins is obviously front and center with many of these in terms of protein nutrition, in terms of the topics, trying to combine protein recommendations for health outcomes. And what we're very much interested in is muscle, in terms of maximizing the muscle anabolic response, but combining that with environmentally sustainable protein sources. So it's about getting that balancing act between ensuring that recommendations combine those two approaches. And I think in sports nutrition, we have a real opportunity here, because I don't know about you, but the pictures on my wall as a child were of athletes, that they were my heroes. And if in sports nutrition, if we're giving those good messages, those positive messages across, that is translating into a sports nutrition, I think that's a strong message to then for the future, i.e. our children, in terms of ensuring that they make good choices in terms of their protein nutrition. And, you know, to boil it down, I think it's about being balanced. It's about not everyone going to become a vegan. That isn't the message. I think it's about maybe making some slightly different choices on certain days of the week, meat-free Monday perhaps, or such like, that can make these differences in terms of not only achieving these healthy protein recommendations, but also sustainable choices as well. One of the things we need to do is educate athletes and practitioners and such like as to complementary plant-based protein sources, for example. So we know that plant proteins are deficient in at least one of the essential amino acids, at least if you take the FAO guidelines on sufficient amino acid values. So if we can educate into what constitutes a complementary plant-based protein dish that essentially meets all of the essential amino acids content, including a high leucine content, because we know that the leucine is important in terms of stimulating the muscle protein synthesis response, then I think we've got strong future in that regard.
In terms of protein research, where do you think the next big area of focus is for protein research?
I think staying on the same topic around the sustainable and looking at different protein sources, I think that looking at these alternative protein sources is going to be coming down the pipe. As far as, we see it more and more in terms of insect protein and the mycoprotein and these other protein sources. It's there. So I think that's the most obvious answer to that. But I think from my perspective, it's around understanding food. So we know lots about individual protein, isolated intact protein. So we know how whey behaves, we know how casein behaves, we know how soy behaves. But what's quite perhaps underappreciated is we don't know how protein-rich foods behave as much. And we get into the matrix effect in that regard. We don't just eat protein, we eat protein within foods, within a matrix.
Yes.
That matrix contains carbohydrates and fat. It contains exosomes in the context of milk. It contains peptides. There's a whole host of different interactions that we see within food. And I think that's the future, is us understanding food, meals, how the muscle responds in our context of sports nutrition, particularly responds to food, protein-rich foods, essentially.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to that, how do we ensure that practitioners or other listeners that hear that don't get too scared in terms of there's a lot to understand, but actually let's bring it back to the simple level here, because that research will hopefully come. But also in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, we know so little at the moment. So from a practical point of view, what would you suggest? Actually, make sure you focus on this for now. What would that be?
I think it's a really tricky response, but I think taking an applied kind of approach, food first approach, is seen in the applied world. My understanding is in the applied world seen as a very that's the starting point, and of course then you're looking at supplementation on top of that if under certain scenarios within certain contexts, and there's absolute value in that under the correct conditions. I think that is the right way to continue, i.e. we need to take this food first approach. We need to ensure that first and foremost, the athlete has sufficient protein intakes. And the way we talk about that in the academic world is around a protein requirement and a protein recommendation. And they're two slightly different things. A protein requirement is the minimum protein intake we call satisfy the metabolic demands for physiological function. But how many athletes bothered about a minimum to satisfy their metabolic demands. They're not interested. They're about looking to optimize their adaptation to training. And that's when we start talking about protein recommendations. So when we talk about protein recommendations, I think we have done quite a nice job in the research to actually categorize this into 5 key topics, i.e. the per meal dose of protein, the different sources of protein that we may combine, the timing of that protein intake, the pattern of that protein intake, but also what other nutrients can be co-ingested with that. So I think it's about trying to keep those 5 key principles of protein nutrition in mind in order to, try and keep things simple. And you can boil that down even further. You could go the 3 T's: total, type, and timing. I think that's, if you can keep that as your foundation for protein, then that's probably, you're not going to go too far wrong in that sense.
I can see people listening to this writing the checklist out now of the 5 key important areas there. That was superb. A question I've got from a practical point of view is, at what level does protein intake become too high? 1.6, 2, 2.2, 2.5, 3 gram per kilo. As a researcher in this area, are any of those levels towards a higher end alarming, or should we be educating the athletes to say you're actually consuming too much now?
I think the biggest concern is when you increase protein intakes to that level, something else has to give. And in the context of athletic performance, the macronutrient that you do not want to compromise is carbohydrate, particularly at higher training volumes. I appreciate that there's certain scenarios in which restricting carbohydrate intake during training can be beneficial from an adaptation perspective. But if you're looking for training quality, then we know that carbohydrate is important. So from a sports nutrition perspective, elevating protein intake needs to be balanced against the other macronutrients that you're going to have to compromise. That would be my key kind of message in a sports nutrition context. Of course, when you apply this into the clinical world, and as well as I do, that things get lost in translation, particularly in social media, etc. So that there is this idea that these high protein intakes are, dangerous from a kidney function perspective or a bone health perspective. This acid ash hypothesis has been proposed, but actually in otherwise healthy individuals, there's no evidence that higher protein intakes can be harmful for these types of health outcomes. Of course, you wouldn't recommend the levels 3 grams per kilogram body mass per day in, say, a patient a dialysis patient, for example, or a patient who's suffering from an underlying kidney issue or renal failure, etc. But that is unlikely to be the case in an athletic scenario. So, but it comes back to what other macronutrients are you compromising, and that particularly becomes a factor in a lot of the studies that we and others have done in the context of weight loss. So energy restricted periods, short-term periods of energy restriction. What can we do in terms of trying to ensure that body composition changes are favorable in that scenario, i.e., we call it high quality weight loss, maximizing the amount of fat mass loss, but maintaining that muscle mass. And there's been several studies that have shown that if you elevate protein intake during that energy restricted diet, then you can actually maintain that muscle mass, or you can even elevate muscle mass, even in a situation of energy restriction, which at the time when my colleague and dear friend, Kevin Tipton, he conducted that study, he was so surprised because, the dogma was that to be able to build muscle, you need to be in energy excess. And actually, you don't necessarily. You can be in an energy deficit as long as you elevate your protein intake, at least in, these were resistance trained young males. So I think, to come back to your question, I think it's about, in a sports nutrition setting, particularly during weight loss scenarios, it's about ensuring that, yes, you can elevate protein intake, but don't do it to the detriment of carbohydrate.
Yeah, really valuable point. And I reflect back on some of my time working with the elite female athletes, and what I've seen there is the want and desire to increase protein content getting in the way of carbohydrate content, in particular leading into match play.
Yeah.
And then you see that under fueling presenting, you see the fatiguing process. So it's a really important point there to educate the players on the context of when an elevated protein intake is gold,
Yeah.
and when actually it's important to shift that and focus on the carbohydrate fueling. And then in terms of the way that we currently assess protein requirements for the normal individual or the athlete or the student athlete, do you think the way that we actually assess the requirements is likely to change?
I think so. We've used what's called a nitrogen balance technique, which is essentially measuring, so of course protein from an amino acids. If we go back to the biochemistry, amino acid contains a nitrogen, whereas we've got carbohydrate and fats, they don't contain any nitrogen. So we're able to measure input of that protein through measuring the nitrogen content of food intake. And so we use nitrogen balance traditionally to determine protein requirement, i.e. nitrogen in versus nitrogen out. And you can measure nitrogen output in the urine, in the sweat, in the feces, etc. But that's quite difficult to do accurately because it's not that easy to obviously get fecal samples, for example. So things have moved on, and we've got a new technique that's out. It's called the indicator amino acid oxidation technique. And that's the technique that I think is going to get much more use in terms of future determinations for endurance athletes, for resistance-based athletes, power-based athletes, concurrent exercise athletes within different scenarios. So there is a whole series of studies looking at different exercise scenarios. So under glycogen depleted training, for example, how does the protein requirement change? And there is evidence that, again, it's elevated even higher under a situation of glycogen depletion, which again does make sense if we look at some of the studies that came out of Liverpool, John Moores, for example, that have looked at glycogen depleted training adaptations, of course, manipulating carbohydrate intake, but what about protein? What do you need to do during those periods to ensure muscle adaptations are optimized? Amazing.
Just as we begin to wrap up, so is there any piece of research that you would like to see carried out? So, money is not an object, resource isn't an object. And what particular research would you like to see and find out that answer to?
So one of the things in protein nutrition that we haven't been able to do is more longer or chronic training studies for those reasons, i.e. it's so expensive to be able to control diet over a longer period of time. So most of the studies are these acute studies. Yeah. So over a short few hours, looking at the response to different protein sources over a short-term 3-4 hour response. I would love to be able to see these more chronic training studies with not measuring muscle protein synthesis as the outcome, but actually looking at muscle mass over 12 to 16 weeks of training again, under different scenarios. So whether it be in an untrained individual becoming trained, or in the context of sports nutrition, perhaps more applicable to athletes that perhaps become injured, for example, are immobilized for a period of time. What can we do to try and offset or mitigate the amount of muscle mass that they lose during that period of time in which they're injured? And perhaps even better still, what can we do for an athlete ahead of when they're about to go in to undergo an operation, for example? So in the research perspective, the idea of prehabilitation is getting a lot of attention. So essentially, what can we do prior to them going into planned surgery to ensure that they come out of that surgery in the best possible place? I think that's a really exciting area of research in a sports nutrition area. And, I don't think enough work has been done in sports nutrition in injury. I think it's, and I think the way forward with that, of course, that's for obvious reasons. It's not ethical to injure someone so on purpose. But I think that where we do have an opportunity is through case studies. Case studies get a bad rap at times. There's an N of 1 or an N of 2, and what can you deduce from that? Well, I believe that you can deduce a lot from that in an elite athlete setting, because you can control something in an elite athlete world, which you can't do in a cohort study, a randomized control study, for example. So I think that could be a good future direction in terms of not just protein nutrition, I think in sports nutrition in general, but I think it applies to protein nutrition. Yeah,
we'll talk offline, because I've got some ideas for you there in terms of the links that I have in some of the clubs. But I'm really glad you said that about almost pre-optimizing what athletes need to be consuming leading into operation? Because it's something that I do with the athletes. We know that there's a surgery date. Okay, what can we do for the next 7 days before surgery to make sure you are absolutely primed, ready for surgery, and then to come out the other side in a really good position? So look, you're a very well-respected practitioner and researcher and academic. People that are listening to this, what would be your top 3 bits of advice for the younger student that might want to follow a career that you've done and have a great academic career?
I think for me, and this isn't something that I did, but if I look back, I would have done, and I always recommend to my students, is during your degree program, during your academic training, don't just do your academic training, try and get some experience in the field of interest, whether it be in applied sports science or whether it be in other aspects of sport and exercise nutrition that you may apply to, whether it's a military scenario or whatever that might be, whatever is your passion. Try and get some experience during your academic training, and join societies. There are some key societies that bring everyone together within the UK with like-minded interests. So the Nutrition Society, the Physiological Society, to name 2, are more from an academic starting point, but they do offer opportunities for students. And you're around like-minded people with many people that also influential in the field, and it's a small world. Sports nutrition, like many other professions, it's a very inspiring profession, and you'll get to meet some amazing people, and you'll get to travel a lot, and no day will be the same. So it's well worth trying to, gain a career within this field. It's a great field to be part of. It's hard work. It's you don't get anything easily. It's a lot of hours, and it's your hobby essentially, and so it becomes easy in that sense. But I'd say, try and get some experience during your academic training. Be a people's person. If you can get on with people, it's amazing how the world goes around. If you're nice to people, things go round, and don't. I guess the other piece of advice is, share your experiences with others and reach out to people. It's amazing how you'd be surprised that people in the higher positions or supposedly higher positions, they've actually got time for younger people. I think I was definitely thinking, I won't contact X, Y, or Z because they don't have enough time. But it's amazing how, people in these positions are very happy to help, because it isn't that long ago that they were in that situation. So, hopefully I've said a few suggestions there, not very coherently, but.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Olly, look, thanks so much for today's episode. I've learned a lot and certainly took so much from that. And it was a pleasure to talk about the future of protein science. Thank you very much.
Cheers, James.